Hello all and welcome back to Real History. I am your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and in this episode we are going to continue our examination of Apple TV Plus's Masters of the Air. Last time we left off, the 100th Bomb Group endured the devastating wrath of the Regensburg raid in 1943, and ultimately their journey took them to North Africa, and that is where this episode is going to pick up. I'm interested to see how the filmmakers are going to balance the carnage that we just saw with how the group recovers and transitions into its new wave of leadership and replacements. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next episode of Masters of the Air. And as always, a friendly reminder, if you have not watched this episode of Masters of the Air, you are well advised to do so before watching further, for there may be some spoilers that are spilled. So as we see here, we are picking up right where we left off, and Frank Murphy, author of Luck of the Draw, had something to say about his arrival here in Tolurgma in North Africa, and it's quite revealing. He said, "We spent our first night in Africa eating the small cans of cheese, dry crackers, and chocolate bars from boxes of K-rations, drinking water from canteens brought from England, rehashing the day and sleeping in and under our airplanes. Sometimes during the night, I was awakened by a tugging at my blanket. Through the shadows, I could see that several ragtag local inhabitants of the area had brazenly entered our airplane and were snatching up everything not bolted down. For the first and only time in my life, I drew my .45 caliber pistol with the idea of protecting myself when I heard someone near me shout, 'Get the hell out of here!' Our looters leaped out of the airplane and scurried away. The last we saw of these robed intruders, they were fleeing into the night, carrying off everything they had managed to steal from us." So, quite the welcoming committee indeed.
There's the 12th. Well, better late than never, huh?
Murphy goes on to note about this partnership with the 12th Air Force. The next morning, a jeep carrying several engineering and maintenance officers from the 12th Air Force drove out to our airplanes. They were followed by trucks loaded with handsome, healthy, tanned young men in khaki shirts and shorts, who were brought out to service the planes. These men were Italian prisoners of war. I have never seen happier, cheerfuller POWs. So the 100th went on quite a journey after this, throughout this whole ferrying system. So they went from Tolurgma to Marrakesh to Casablanca, around Portugal, continuing around France, and then on to the United Kingdom. So quite a journey to get back home to their base at Thorp Abbotts.
Don't count on it.
You'll notice that Major Egan here is wearing a fez in this scene, and there is a story behind that. When the survivors of the Regensburg mission stayed over in Marrakesh, they were provided accommodations at this luxury hotel with like hibiscus gardens and an orange grove. I mean, it was pretty deluxe living in comparison to what they had been living in Algiers. And while they were drinking at this fancy outdoor bistro, the Yanks actually swapped their caps for red fezzes with a group of soldiers from Senegal, no less. And so the hat for Egan, it became somewhat of this trademark item that allowed him to further stand out in a crowd. And he would pin his Major's pin, his Major's emblem, on the very front of it. And shortly thereafter, when the 100th arrived back at Thorp Abbotts, the press actually interviewed Egan and other airmen. And this story of their return back to England appeared on the August 24th, 1943 front page of Stars and Stripes newspaper. And you can look that up and read it for yourself. But today, the fez is actually on display in the special 100th Bomb Group display case at the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force. So pretty cool stuff to check out.
Bailey.
So now we're being reintroduced to William Quinn and Charles Bailey as they reunite in Nazi-occupied Belgium. And here is what Quinn later attested to in his escape and evasion report. And a lot of this wonderful material is available on the 100th Bomb Group Foundation website, which we include a link to in the caption below. And I believe this portion pertains to August 17th, 1943, where he talks about the precarious situation that they find themselves in. Toward 2300 hours, I heard someone whistling as they went through the woods. I investigated and found 2 people from the original crowd. They told me there were Germans everywhere and that some arrests had been amongst the crowd. We cautiously moved out into a cornfield. Civilian clothes were brought for me and I put them on. We were all of the opinion that this field offered no proper hiding place, so another briar patch was found. I was given a blanket and spent the night amongst the thorns. And then things get really interesting as he continues here. And he notes, at 1000 hours on 18th August, a man was brought to the briar patch to see me. He asked me if I knew Sergeant Bailey. I said yes. He told me that the sergeant was with him and I would be taken to see him. I spent the whole day in the little briar patch in which I had slept. That night, after dark, we made rendezvous. From then on, our journey was arranged, and I traveled with Sergeant Bailey.
Who's he? That's Bob. Which group you say you're from again?
As to the mysterious Bob, the Bob without a last name who's mentioned here of the 306th, his bomb group was in fact part of the Schweinfurt segment of the mission. And one of the few areas where those 2 portions of that air armada overlapped in their flight paths was in the Brussels region. So it's possible that these evaders of different groups might have met at the ground level in a situation like this. But we'll see if Bob really is who he says he is. But all in all, I feel that this is a good representation of one of the busier evacuation lines that were to be found in Belgium. And this one in particular was overseen by an operator named Charles Guyette, who was very, very busy here in 1943 and 1944, funneling down Allied airmen to safety.
25 was the magic number.
Indeed, you would be hard-pressed to find an airman who didn't have a tally sheet somewhere marking that countdown toward 25 missions. But then it became 30 missions, and then it became 35 missions. And my friend and co-author, John Homan, co-author of Into the Cold Blue, which looks at his experiences in the 8th Air Force during World War II, he has something to say about this. And this is an excerpt from our book. And we note in 1943, the B-17 Memphis Belle gained national acclaim when she became one of the first American bombers to fulfill a 25 mission quota. Her crew became the subject of an iconic documentary and returned to America with great fanfare, hoisted as poster boys for war bond sales. Unlike the fortunate members of Belle, John says here, I could not head home after 25 missions. Much had changed in the year since, that is by 1944 that is. Generals realized they could no longer forfeit our skills after 24 missions. Attrition rates were too high for experienced crews to be released. The mandatory number for a full tour of duty thereby rose to 30. The odds seemed increasingly pitted against us.
Hey, to the fellows who aren't here tonight, who should have been.
Drink to that.
So John Dye and some of his crew did in fact have a 25th mission farewell party, and Harry Crosby, author of A Wing and a Prayer, upon which much of this series is based, dedicates a concise but meaningful paragraph to this occasion. And he says, on this mission, one crew, piloted by Glenn Dye, flew their 25th mission. They were done. They could go home. They were the only original crew of the 100th original 35 who finished a tour. 1 out of 35 made it through a tour, he reemphasizes there. And even on Dye's crew, 1 gunner was killed. None of the original crew all made it. That did not encourage us much. Something else I will add here from a production design point. Once more, the fantastic research that went into all this. This is a near perfect recreation of the Officers Club at Thorp Abbotts, going from photographs that I have seen. The island bar sort of in the middle, even the panel lighting in the ceiling. I mean, it's a near flawless recreation. And of course, Glenn Miller's In the Mood is playing in the background. Of all the 1940s swing dances I've attended, I think every single one of them has kicked off with In the Mood. So an instantly recognizable tune from the war years. As we are absorbing this fairly classy environment and everybody wearing their pinks and greens and Class A chocolate dress uniforms and whatnot, I suppose now is a good time for a little bit of show and tell, because I have one such crusher cap, as it was known, right here. And this is one of the gems of my collection, just because it's in such good shape. A lot of times when you find these at an antique store or a flea market or whatever, they're just crushed to smithereens and full of moth holes. Really lucked out with this one. And this one was owned by Glenn Benston, who was a second lieutenant, and the tag inside also features his serial number. So a great little piece of material culture from the 1940s that we have here.
You came halfway around the world to hand out coffee and donuts.
I suspect the character of Helen very well may be a composite character, but as we've addressed here before, women like her were very much present on base. This is what the 100th Bomb Group Museum has to say about women as such. Although the majority of personnel stationed at Thorp Abbotts were men, women played a vital role in the war effort in general, and at Thorp Abbotts in particular. Perhaps the most remembered women from Thorp Abbotts were those associated with the American Red Cross. Among them was Betty Hardman, Hilda Peirce, and Dorothy Durang, known as Dot. All these women served at the base. Betty in particular made an impression on Second Lieutenant Tony Peck, a co-pilot on the David W. Wood crew. Peck danced with Betty at an officer club dance on 26 November 1944 and described Betty in his diary as a marvelous dancer. He exclaimed that it was a pleasure to be with her. She, in my opinion, was the essence of American femininity: poise, clothes, looks, and popularity. Too darn popular, if you ask me. And so we really get a sense that these Red Cross workers, they aren't merely here to be objects of affection or playthings for the flyboys who are on base. They're here to offer a little bit of comfort and a slice of home. This idea of serving coffee and donuts, writing letters, maybe helping an airman even prepare his will, organize family matters. The list went on and on and on of the various sort of philanthropic and charitable functions that the American Red Cross did on these bases and elsewhere, in places like London too, for that matter. Red Cross workers were almost universally held in particularly high regard among these service members. Herbert Nash, meanwhile, was a real individual, and he was a guy who had, ironically enough, previously been an insurance salesman, and he was from Huntington, West Virginia, which, coincidentally, the same town where Carwood Lipton of Band of Brothers fame also hailed from.
All these are new faces. When we go down, they won't remember us either. We never existed, Buck.
I find these fatalistic sentiments to be quite accurate, because whether you were typical line infantry or whether you were an airman in a bomb group with high attrition rates, there was often this sense of suspicion, I don't want to say distrust, but a hesitance to get to know all of the new guys. One, you didn't want to be emotionally hurt if and when they were killed. And likewise, you didn't want them to be afflicted in the same way if you yourself were killed in action. And so it's this terrible, lethal sort of arithmetic that is going through the minds of the likes of Egan here. And increasingly, it's just something that didn't settle too well with a lot of these men.
What counts is that you soldiers show up ready and able to fight.
This is classic Colonel Harding, truly. I can't remember dialogue exactly like this from any of the books, but it very much sounds like his real life persona. I mean, this is a guy who would say, our group never backs down, we never let up, we are going to take on every maximum effort possible. That was just his style. And while Harding was an excellent aviator and he was a beloved leader by most, I think into the latter phases of some of his missions, the men thought he was a bit too cavalier and gung-ho at times, and we really get a sense of that coming through in this dialogue.
Michu is your guide.
She's barely a teenager.
So Michu was one of the code names for Michel Dumont, who was perhaps one of the most heroic and prolific members of the Belgian resistance during World War II. If memory serves correctly, she helped somewhere between 200 and 300 Allied airmen escape to neutral or Allied countries via the so-called Comet Line, which was one of the busiest routes for funneling airmen away from their would-be captors. And one of the keys to her success was constant movement. She was of the mind, you have a broad network of trusted friends, try to sleep in a different house every night. These were some of the key tactics of avoiding capture. And it would seem that it was a tactic that worked. Curiosity got the best of me here, and I was wondering if there actually was a place called Cafe Warsaw or something like that in London during the war years. I couldn't find anything, but I know that places like this very much did exist. And something else that my friend John Homan of the 489th Bomb Group attested to was just how cosmopolitan and international London was during this time. And he said that there were New Zealanders and Australians and people from South Africa, there was Free French, there were people from every corner of the United Kingdom. There were soldiers from the Netherlands and Norway that had escaped their countries either before or after they had been overrun. And he said when you walked through London, you really had a sense of the international coalition that was the Allied forces. And it was something that struck him in a very surprising and moving way.
I suppose if you were looking to buy, you could get one in Piccadilly.
The reference here to Piccadilly, she's telling Egan to look in Piccadilly, and of course she's referencing Piccadilly Circus, and why Piccadilly Circus was often a popular place for Allied and I suppose particularly American service members is because that's where you could most easily find prostitutes. And these prostitutes were often nicknamed Piccadilly Commandos. And in fact, some service members who didn't even try to rent out the services of a prostitute, they would develop these sort of spectator sport games where they would see if they could pick out a prostitute while they were watching on the sidelines and see how long it would take her to approach a serviceman and how many servicemen she would have to approach until she could find a customer. And so even if you didn't pursue these carnal pleasures in Piccadilly Circus, it was still quite a spectacle that could offer you a degree of entertainment. So we're really digging in the weeds on this one, because I was also wondering, was there actually a bombardment on London here on October 8th, 1943? And so the newspaper archives, of course, is the best place to dig up this information. And lo and behold, I found a very brief article from the Associated Press, October 8th, 1943, that says this: "The Germans sent a considerable number of planes over England before midnight, probably the largest number at one time since 1941, to strike at London and several other places for their longest raid of the year. Using a puny imitation of Allied diversified bombing tactics, the Germans chose scattered targets, but only a few attackers managed to reach London, and most of the noise came from the barrage of anti-aircraft guns." So whether this was an actual good bit of research that was incorporated here or dumb luck, I know not, but this actually happened at this given time here on that night of October 8th.
The closer you are to death, the more alive you feel.
In this rather steamy hotel scene, I think we really get to the heart of the matter that I think is a big theme to reflect upon in this episode. And, you know, some naysayers will probably say, well, why isn't there more combat? Why aren't there more missions in this episode? And I'm firmly of the belief is that you really need some breather space between these missions. I think emotionally as well as cinematically. If you just have these endless scenes of carnage through flak-filled sky in every single episode, they're all going to blur together and they aren't going to be unique. And you're going to lose some of the oomph to the storyline. I mean, this is just basic storytelling. But it also gives us opportunity for conversations like this. And in the books that I've written and in the literally tens of thousands of newspaper articles that I've read from between 1942 and 1945, people were living in the moment. Young people were living in the moment. Longevity was the last thing that was certain for them. They were embracing life. They were living at an accelerated speed. They were embracing any opportunity that was put upon them. They embraced making love, going out and partying, doing wild and crazy things, because this is what young people who confront death on a weekly basis do. So this is, in my mind, a very authentic conversation and a very real emotion being expressed in these scenes. You didn't know how long you were going to live, and by God, you were going to make most of the time that you had left on this planet. And who can blame them? I think now's an appropriate time to reflect upon some of the words of Ken Lemons, who in the 1990s wrote a memoir. It's a really hard book to come across, I find, but I was lucky enough to locate one. And this is what he has to say about this particular day. Following too closely on the heels of the Regensburg raid was the October 8th mission to Bremen, which was protected by an estimated 300 anti-aircraft guns. Alerted for an 11:45 a.m. takeoff, the 100 put up 21 aircraft. The 100th was leading the 13th Combat Wing today, and Piccadilly Lily was leading the 100th. Murphy and the crew were in good spirits as they made their way out to the aircraft. The gunners were joking with each other as they loaded their gear. Murphy leaned out of the cockpit and I saluted him. He motioned for me to remove the chocks so that he could begin to taxi. Smiling his lopsided smile, he saluted me and then closed his window and went to work, which we see in a scene very similar to this right here. He also speaks of this very elaborate procedure that was involved with takeoff. And he notes the pilots would take off every 30 seconds and begin the intricately choreographed moves required to form hundreds of bombers into a coherent group. Spiraling upwards, the squadrons would form up first, and then the group would assemble. Something else that I really like about Lemon's firsthand account is he talks about this somewhat tense downtime, this interim time between takeoff and return of the aircraft. And this is the sort of everyday routine stuff that I think is very insightful. Around time for the boys to return, we'd start to gather along the flight line. Once again, the officers would be up on the tower. Many of them had binoculars to help them watch for returning aircraft. Sometimes there would be a game of catch, baseball or football going on among the guys. As soon as the first plane was sighted, though, there was a flurry of activity as fire trucks and ambulances were manned and started. And of course, every now and again, Lemons and his crew would have to become impromptu first aid men to help these casualties get out of their planes and seek treatment. Lemons referencing baseball is another good opportunity to reflect upon something very simple, but I think very neat from my collection. And that's this wonderful piece of baseball memorabilia right here. And it just may look like a typical piece of equipment from the time period, but what makes this special is that it has Special Services U.S. Army stamped right here. And even though it's flaking and it's not in great shape anymore, I can only imagine who used this and where and what it meant to them as they were playing with it. But it's an interesting side note to point out that the #1 purchaser of athletic equipment in the world in the first half of the 1940s was none other than the U.S. Army. Lemons making the fix here under the pressure of the moment and getting the thumbs up from Clevin. Such a great scene, and I know our producer Andy is very happy with this scene, I'm sure, himself having been an Army mechanic and often lamenting that mechanics and all these sort of behind-the-scenes individuals who are essential to military operations never get any love on the screen. Well, this series has finally rectified that. So I know one of the big questions about this episode is, did this really happen? Is he actually climbing up into the wheels there as this aircraft is taxiing? And in short, the answer is yes. And Lemons has something to say about that. Even though it was a different mission, and I believe a different plane. He notes one Dawn, the plane named She Has To, would not check below a 100 RPMs on left magneto. After a plug change, the magneto drop was still too much. A decision had to be made because the flight crew was already on their way out to the hard stand for briefing. When they arrived, I talked to the pilot and told him it was the point in the magneto and for him not to start the number 3 engine. I told him to start the other 3, taxi out onto the ramp and get in line. Now, to say that he was a little skeptical about this was an understatement, and the look he gave me from the cockpit said as much. Maximum effort or not, a fully loaded B-17 could not take off with only 3 functioning engines, and this man was not about to put his crew and his ship in jeopardy by trying. I told him to just give me the chance, and he agreed. I crawled into the wheel well as the pilot started up the engines. While the ship taxied, I took off the firewall plate, removed the magneto cap, and adjusted the points. By the time I got the cap back on and the firewall plate in place, the plane was down the line past the control tower. I jumped out and gave the pilot a startup signal for number 3. He started it up and ran it to 2,000 RPMs, and it only had a 50 RPM drop. I smiled and gave him the OK sign and a silent prayer for good luck. That was quite a ride, I'll tell you that. So you may be able to notice here that there are red flares in the far background there coming out of one of the planes approaching the strip. And this has special significance, both from a logistical standpoint and an emotional standpoint for people like Ken Lemons, as he says here. Any aircraft which shoots off a red flare indicating that there are wounded aboard has priority to land. There are a lot of flares in the sky today. The ambulances race after the landing aircraft. I've counted 9 ships so far with significant battle damage, and still there is no Piccadilly Lily. As the planes continue to land, I run the names through my head. Pasadena Nina, Our Baby, Stymie, Messy Bessie. Piccadilly Lily is not there. A knot is forming in my stomach. But I keep telling myself she could have landed at another field. Perhaps Murphy had to ditch her in the channel and is even now being picked up by British Air Sea Rescue. It's like watching for a lost child. It is the waiting that gets to you. But there isn't anything else to do but wait until the officers update us after debriefing.
It was hell up there today. Lieutenant Nash didn't make it.
The prophecy does indeed come true. Herbert G. Nash Jr. died at age 25 after his disabled plane had gone into a nosedive and crashed. His remains were repatriated to Huntington, West Virginia in 1949, and that is where he rests today. Newspaper reports of the time indicate that he left behind a wife named Virginia. One thing that I'm curious about, will we see German dead in this series? Will we see scenes similar to this in large metropolitan areas that the Allies bombed? Will we reflect on the fact that war is often the story of embracing evil to defeat a greater evil? These are some of the moral complexities that I think are fundamental to understanding the air war during World War II. And I'm really interested to see it. I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to some extent, see the other side and how they are likewise being affected by this all-consuming vortex of violence. So as we reflect upon this growing list of losses, I once again find it entirely appropriate to reflect upon something that Ken Lemons had to say on this point. He wrote, "We were learning to put the losses out of our minds. At least we tried, because we knew that tomorrow we'd lose another one. One mission at a time. That's how we got through it. One mission at a time." That's what we told ourselves over and over. And sure enough, on the next day, October 9th, 1943, a lot of these men would be going back into the meat grinder. In this episode, we also learn that Gail Cleven has gone missing. I'm wondering if the next episode will show how that transpires. So, more on that to come. That wraps up this episode of Real History. And while I foresee some people thinking that this episode's a little bit slower because it doesn't have an endless stream of fireballs in it or whatever, I really like this episode. I think it's necessary for the purposes of carrying the narrative forward. It allows us to reflect upon, like I said, this large coalition that we can find building up in England. It gives us a growing sense of post-traumatic stress, ideas of coping with loss. We get a glimpse of the British home front, which I really like. This episode exposes us to all sorts of things beyond the scope of Thorp Abbotts and the missions that men fly from that base. I think this was a really good episode, and I liked it for both its historical and cinematic merits. So there you go. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of Real History. If you haven't done so already, please make sure you hit that subscribe button below. As I also mentioned, please check out the website of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation. We welcome you to support that organization in any way you see fit. And you also may be interested in checking out the information about my latest book that I co-authored with World War II Airman John Homan, which is entitled Into the Cold Blue. You can find that information down below as well. We'll see you next time on Real History, and until then, as always, stay curious.